Who fucking cares? Retro gaming. I cared. I just kind of want to talk about, like, you know, hey, my passion, my love for the old school garbage, and what the current state of all of this is for me personally, and how I perceive just generally gaming as a whole. So ever since I was really young, I remember just having a big fondness for like classic anything. I loved looking at media and just seeing like, oh, what was this like 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. As a kid, I was really into animation. I wanted to be an animator. I wanted to make cartoons. I drew my own comics. I would try to make my own animations in like Microsoft Paint, and then, you know, do frame by frame animation by like putting all the pictures together in Windows Movie Maker. That sounds impressive. It wasn't. But like, I had so much respect and just passion for just watching all these old shorts from like the 40s, 50s, and all of this, and just like whatever, getting a respect for the golden era of this medium. And the same can be said for movies. I remember loving watching like Turner Classic Movies and watching like all the black and white stuff and just respecting these origins of like, you know, this artistic medium that I really enjoyed. I always loved like going back to the past and just seeing, you know, what all this looked like and how everything played out back then. And that can definitely be said about video games. A lot of the games that I played as a kid were already pretty retro games. You know, I had a Game Boy Advance, and most of the notable games on that thing were like old school Super Nintendo games just ported to the GBA. You know, one of my favorite childhood games was Super Mario World on the Game Boy Advance, Yoshi's Island on the Game Boy Advance. Mario Kart Super Circuit was heavily based on Super Mario Kart. And then in terms of games I didn't have, you know, you had Donkey Kong Country series, The Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past. You know, it was very easy in my generation to kind of become accustomed to these old school titles. But outside of just that, you know, I had an NES at my grandma's house that I played a lot. You know, I would play through Mario 3, Mario 1 and Duck Hunt, Kung Fu Heroes, Ninja Turtles 3, Excite Bike. We had a big stack of like a lot of the games that a lot of people had back in the 80s and 90s for that old school Nintendo. And yeah, I just found it to be like really simple fun. I couldn't get anywhere else. There was something about Mario 3 that was just so addicting and just really just inspiring, just how detailed the world was for being an old 8-bit game, you know? Like, you could do so much in that game. It felt like something that should be on like my Game Boy Advance, but instead it was on like this old ass TV in the corner of my grandma's house. It was almost like a little treat every time I'd go over. I could play games on this old system, you know, I didn't have. You know, I just really loved looking back and just seeing like all these old classic games that this entirely different generation grew up with. And especially when we got an updated Windows Vista computer, you know, Windows Vista was pretty dog, but hey, at least I got Windows Movie Maker on it and Windows DVD Maker. And for some reason, I would go on Wikipedia and I would look up all this stuff about all these video games, and I would just save all the box art to my desktop. I don't know why. I'm sorry to my parents who probably had just clogged hard drives of all this stuff. But yeah, for some reason, like, that was just a pastime I would do. I would be like, well, I gotta save every single Mario box art I find. But with all of these gaming experiences, and then in addition, my Wikipedia binges that would lead me down rabbit holes where I would see all this stuff about all these retro games and the history of the medium and all these consoles and all of this stuff, I ended up kind of turning to YouTube and websites like GameTrailers.com and IGN, and I just fell in love with looking at the history of this medium. It was so addicting to me. I saw so many like different web shows based around like the history of video games at the time. One that I specifically remember was called Play Value. And this you could download as like a video podcast on like your iPod or iPhone or whatever. And I downloaded like all the episodes and I would watch these all the time. They were like these really well-made documentary interview style pieces about certain subjects in video games, where you had all these different people from like all these different websites or like some game developers or just personalities or what have you, and they would just explain video game history from their perspectives. And I just found it to be really well made for like 2008 era YouTube web video stuff. I would go on GameTrailers.com and watch their retrospectives, their top 10s, their reviews, all of that. And especially the stuff from like screwattack.com, that would include like the Angry Video Game Nerd, all of their top 10s, their video game vaults. But then that eventually went to mostly like YouTube. You know, YouTube was kind of just the place where you watched all the videos about all the games, everything, you know. It became uncool to have to click on a website link to watch a video from your favorite creator or whatever. And around that late 2000s, early 2010s era was when like everybody was making like these retro gaming videos and whatnot. Be making top 10s, reviews, retrospectives, all of this stuff. It was cool to look back at like an old NES game and just talk about it, make fun of it, or just critique it or whatever. And eventually, like, I really wanted to get into retro game collecting. I was watching like all these game room tours. There was like Nintendo collecting, there was World of Nintendo, CJR. There was just all these YouTube channels with like these insane game rooms that I looked at in awe. A lot of these like genuinely inspired me in like how I wanted to organize my stuff or like how I wanted to collect my stuff and whatnot. All these obscure games, all these interesting releases. And, you know, I ended up like playing a lot of NES at my grandma's house, but when we finally got Wi-Fi at our house, I eventually got my Wii hooked up to that, and I would download NES games all the freaking time. Soccer for NES, anybody? Not me, actually me, because I bought it and yeah, I played it a couple times. But regardless, I really loved retro games. I know I'm talking about me consuming a lot of media about retro games, but like, man, I played Punch-Out to death, the Mega Man series to death. I really loved River City Ransom, of course, all the Marios. Sega Genesis has like a ton of like really cool hidden gems. Like probably my favorite Genesis game is Gunstar Heroes. Like that game is incredible. Of course, I'm a platformer fan at heart, so, you know, I like the Sonics and whatnot, but you know, there's still a lot of really great stuff on Sega Genesis. I mean, right here, we have Rocket Knight Adventures, Ghouls and Ghosts. A lot of that era is just so interesting. I mean, you have like all these weird-ass consoles, the CDI, 3DO, Atari Jaguar, and like all the random junk on those platforms and how it all played out in history. You know, the competition between all of those guys and Nintendo and Sega and eventually Sony. Like, there's so much going on in retro gaming when it comes to not only the games, but also the culture at the time and the legacy these systems have left. And it made for like incredibly interesting discussions. I love talking about retro games and listening to people talking about retro games, like just as much as just playing the stuff. I remember just sitting down one night and I was just like, man, like I'm gonna play through Mega Man 2 on the original NES. I beat that game on the original NES, and I just felt like, damn, like all these 40-year-olds that nonstop talk about the NES games being the best things, the peak of humanity, would be so damn proud of me. But that was all a good few years ago. Things are definitely feeling a little different now. And I just kind of want to talk about why retro gaming just kind of feels, I don't know, man. It just feels a lot lamer these days than it did back then. Back then, it felt cool to like look back at all these old things, and for other games to like reference old games or just like do like throwbacks or just like show like sprite art and whatnot and just kind of bring us back to those 8-bit glory days. Nowadays, like, I'm kind of like, who fucking cares? So why is that? Well, I can go through a couple of reasons why, you know, it's harder for me to really care about, you know, a lot of retro gaming. And when I talk about retro gaming, I kind of mean anything prior to, like, maybe the 6th generation, you know, PS2, Xbox, GameCube. Of course, you know, that's kind of the era I grew up in, you know, so it's fair that I'm not sick of that era, but to some extent, I am as well. But let's talk about, like, the old school stuff. You know, going back as far as, like, 2nd generation, 3rd generation of game consoles, you know, Atari 2600, 5200, 7800, Intellivision, ColecoVision. To be fair, I don't think people have cared about that kind of stuff for a long time, but that kind of addresses what I think is like an issue here. You know, people were nostalgic over like the Atari era for a bit there. Remember like all those Atari flashback consoles, you know, the plug and play stuff. Those were genuinely pretty popular back in like the early to mid 2000s, but nowadays, like, like, who the hell is buying this stuff? It must do, like, slightly well. Like, they always keep pumping out something new Atari nostalgia-wise, but I partially think that's because Atari is a well-known name, and also just, like, it's probably dirt cheap to license Atari junk, you know? That's why I saw, like, My Arcade put out, like, this Atari console. There's, like, the Atari 2600 Plus, but, like, you know, that stuff always comes out, like, something like that comes out every year, but then, like, nobody really uses them. I always see that stuff just clog up store shelves. It just kind of goes on clearance, and then that's the end of it. And then a new thing comes out, and that goes on clearance, and that's the end of it. But I think a major problem with, like, that era of gaming is the fact that, like, I think all the people who had a chance to get nostalgic over it, you know, the people that grew up with that stuff in the 70s and early 80s, you know, they got nostalgic over it, and now, like, those people have moved on. You know, either they're Atari fans or they've just kind of moved on with their lives. They got nostalgic over it. They bought their little plug-and-play consoles. They bought their games back and their console and all of that stuff. And now they're just like, all right, I'm good. You know, I think you kind of hit that era in like your mid to late 20s, early 30s, where you look back at an earlier time in your life and you're like, man, what I would give to relive those memories. Then after that, it's just kind of like, okay, well, I relived those memories. I'm good now. And I think the second generation of gaming had its time to shine, you know, it did its thing, and now, like, I don't know, you just don't see anybody talking about those games anymore. And in many cases, that's probably because, like, these games just haven't really aged well. There's not a ton of franchises that were on Atari, Intellivision, ColecoVision that are still super relevant these days. Like, sure, we'll always see, like, a new upgraded version of like Asteroids come out or something like that, but it's not a big deal when that happens, you know? No. It's all about the NES era. This is like the big boy time. This is what everybody was nostalgic over. Back in like the early 2010s, everybody was talking about old NES games. People were making funny game reviews. And yeah, like, I loved collecting old NES stuff. I loved playing old NES stuff. And, you know, I still do to an extent. But when it comes to, like, if I care, not really. I think it's mainly down to the fact that, like, I don't really know what else there is to say about a lot of this NES stuff. I feel like I've said everything there is to say about these old school games. I feel like everybody on the internet has said everything there is to say about Mario 3. I feel like everybody said everything there is to say about all the Mega Man games and Zelda 1 and Zelda 2 and all of that stuff. And that doesn't mean I'm not going to talk about those games. No, I'll definitely talk about those games. I would love to talk about those games in their own distinct Scott the Woz episodes or Scott Stash uploads or whatever. But there would have to be like a spin put on it, you know? Like, I just don't really feel like there's anything of note you can really say about Kirby's Adventure anymore. Because, like, people have had a chance to get nostalgic over this game. They got nostalgic over it. You know, they looked back on it. They made their comments. They made their critiques. And now it's just like, you know, there's like thousands of videos. There's thousands of reviews and retrospectives about this game and all other NES games out on the internet. And these games are so simple that it's just like, at this point, I'm kind of questioning, like, what more can you add to this conversation? That doesn't mean don't talk about these games. Far from it. I'm just talking about my personal interest level of, like, why it isn't as interesting for me to, like, talk about these NES games anymore, because I'm like, what else is there more to say? We all know what NES games are good. We all know what NES games are bad. And I think what makes it even worse is the fact that, like, these games are so simple. You know, you can very easily emulate every single game here. And, you know, what really stinks is just, like, the prices of these games on the secondhand market is just getting absurd. You know, you would have thought that, like, game prices have stagnated at this point, and I feel like NES stuff, like, it just isn't as in high demand as it was before. It is genuinely just for enthusiasts at this point because, like I said, emulation is just so damn simple, especially for NES games, that, like, if you really want to play NES games, you know, there is something to be said about, like, oh, authentic hardware, but at the same time, it's like NES emulation has pretty much been perfected to the point where it's really hard to warrant spending more than like a couple bucks at this point on an NES cartridge. And even outside of like PC emulation, just like pretty much all the NES games I'd care to play are on like the Nintendo Switch NES Online app, or they're available via collections with bonus features or rewind functionality or whatever that just makes the games more enjoyable to experience, which is another thing. A lot of the retro gaming community that's out there, and this has been a thing since like, you know, back during the early days of all of this, you know, like late 2000s, early 2010s, there is so much of a stick up so many of their asses. Like there's a stigma that like, oh, my NES games are so much better than your modern garbage because like our games were hard and replayable and I can beat them one try, no problem, and you can't even get past the first level, you fucking baby. These are real games. Okay, that's another thing. Acting like this era of gaming was like so much better and more pure than, you know, modern day stuff, I think is absolutely ridiculous. I'm not saying that like these days it's better, because like these days has its own problems, but like to act like back in the day everything was so good, it's just, no, there was so much shady shit going on. Like Nintendo basically held a monopoly on the video game industry at the time. No third parties could make games for like Sega or like TurboGrafx or anything at the time. Games were made artificially difficult so then people would rent them more and more and more. And let's not forget that like 90% of the NES library is garbage. Obviously these days has a lot of problems, you know, for sure. And like, yeah, I can look back at like, you know, stuff that was happening back then, and it's just like, yeah, when you get the game, you got the game. But that didn't mean any of these games weren't like broken or had tons of glitches or whatnot. And that's the thing, you know, like people are complaining about these days how games ship broken and glitched out and all of that, but it's like a lot of these games are just fucking glitchy as all hell. Sprites flicker all the time. They have major slowdown. They like some of these games just flat out like break on certain levels and they can't do a damn thing about it. Yes, a lot of modern games ship in like pretty bad states, but like, hey, like we get updates and like people bitch about the updates, but it's just like, what do you want? People look at Kirby's Adventure as like this amazing classic on the NES, but like it has horrible slowdown. Like this game has a horrible fucking frame rate. So if like the modern equivalent came out these days, people would trash it. People would be like, this is unplayable. This is ridiculous. This is unacceptable for Nintendo to release a game like this. The notion that things were better back then, that these games are better, they're like, and I'm better than you because I can play through this game without save states or rewind functionality. It's just like, I think is ridiculous. Like if you're like an esports competitor, sure, like that takes actual skill. You train for months to just get to that level. That is, you know, it's a skill, you know, like you really earn that. Beating Castlevania 1 is hard, but it's like, no, like who cares? You're not this amazing player if you can beat that game. Yes, it's a difficult game, but there are lots of difficult games out there. I've beaten lots of difficult games and I'm fucking dog shit at video games. So act like you're better for beating Castlevania 1 without rewind or save states or what have you. I think it's just like, okay, you know, like you can be like, yeah, I beat it without save states and rewind functionality. That's one thing. But to shame people for doing that because it's not how the actual game plays, it's just like, motherfucker, on the playground, you are swapping secrets about cheat codes, Game Genie, all this nonsense. You are reading Nintendo Power for tips and maps and all of this stuff. And if you weren't getting help, you were spending 5 damn months on the same NES game, a game that you can beat in 5 minutes these days. So in my opinion, it's really not that much about skill. It's more so about how much time you can devote to beating this game. Who fucking cares? I'm not impressed if somebody can beat an NES game. Like, I'm like, that's cool. But it's just like, I don't care. Like, I'm just over it. Like, I grew up around kind of that rhetoric because, like, I remember seeing a lot of retro gaming reviews and top 10s where, you know, it's very much like, yeah, these games were balls hard and, like, that's how we like them and all of that stuff. And, like, I get it, but when you're kind of being a dick about it, that's when I'm like, all right, buddy, like, come on, man. I think I'm just kind of burnt out on 80s nostalgia stuff. Like, I love looking back at, like, the 80s, but, like, I think I think it's gotten overdone at this point. I think we've done enough, like, looking back at the 8-bit era of games. I think we've done enough of just, like, all of this stuff. You know, and especially you look at, like, Nintendo and Sega and how much they just, like, show all this junk from, like, oh my god, look at that, 8-bit Mario's in Mario Odyssey. Oh my god, little 8-bit Mario running across the screen. Oh, look at that, look at that, look at that. And, like, all Sega does is, like, reference the 16-bit era. They just reference the Sega Genesis stuff they've done, or they do only Sega Genesis compilations. I'm like, I'm just fucking sick of the 8 and 16-bit eras. I gotta be honest. Like, it's had its time. We've gotten nostalgic over it. We've looked back, and I'm just kind of like, I'm empty when it comes to this stuff. Like, there's just not much more I can pull from this era. And it even extends to the next era, which is PS1 and 64. And it's mainly because, like, that era just doesn't age well. I'm just like, I mean, like, I can look back at that era, but it's just like, yeah, like, I just got nothing left about that one either. I love certain games from that time, but 90% of that library, I'm just like, god damn, this is rough to go back to. And it's really weird to see how, like, more and more people are nostalgic over the Wii era, you know, because it's just like, that just felt like it just damn happened. But yeah, I mean, you look at, like, people who grew up with that, they're nearing 30, like me. And I just feel like when it comes to talking about a lot of games like that, there's just more going on with them. You know, having, like, 3D environments or more possibilities for, like, weird glitches or speed running tactics or whatever. Like, I feel like those games are just more interesting to talk about these days. Whereas I still love all this old stuff, but when it comes to, like, what I'm mostly interested in, like, I'm a bit over anything from, like, N64 prior. And that's just because, like, one, it's all been overdone. This is the stuff that's been hammered in our skull to be nostalgic over, or be like, well, man, classic garbage for, like 2 decades at this point, honestly. And I also find that a lot of people who are just all about retro or nothing, they're very much kind of like, F you, this is how you play retro games, and if you play them in any other way, you're a fraud. And it's just kind of like, you know, who cares? Who cares? They're games. Games. Play games. Have fun. You play games. They're to have fun with. And yeah, I can still have fun with a lot of these games, but when it comes to discussing them or just reminiscing about them or whatever, there's just not much left I have to say about a lot of stuff from NES, SNES, N64, Game Boy, like anything like that. I still love this stuff to death, but, you know, I'm just trying to explain, like, how my perspective kind of shifts over the years. I will always have a fondness for all eras in gaming. But hey, sometimes you just kind of fall out of love a bit with some eras, and you start to appreciate others more and more. Sometimes I'm kind of like, you know what, Atari's pretty cool. And then I come back to reality, and I'm like, okay, well, you know, the art's cool. Enjoy what you enjoy, but don't look down upon others for enjoying what they enjoy. And if it's in a different way than how you like to enjoy it, who fucking cares? That person has no bearing on your life at all. And if anything, just look at yourself and be like, ooh, I'm better because I'm enjoying it the way I think I should. There you go, buddy. You beat Star Fox on the Super Nintendo without hitting the rewind button on Nintendo Switch Online. Congratulations. Do you want a medal? Retro gaming was a ton of fun to get into. But at this point in my life, you know, I haven't bought a new NES game in a while. Same with Super Nintendo, same with N64. Just kind of at a point where these eras aren't very exciting for me, or they're that interesting overall. You know, I'm still interested in them to an extent, but, you know, that only goes so far. How far? This far.